When I ask the companies I meet how many restoration tests they perform each year, the answer is often the same. We do not do any, or we do not do enough. The reasons mentioned are generally the same. First, they do not have enough available storage to perform restorations. Secondly, it is complicated for them to interrupt certain critical applications while restoring them. And finally, teams struggle to find time for these operations, which are often very manual. But I want to say that this was before. Since then, Veeam has found the solution. Hello and welcome to Back to Basics, a series of videos in which I revisit the most iconic technological innovations of Veeam and reflect on the fundamentals that have contributed to the company's reputation and success for over 15 years now. Today, I'm going to talk to you about one of those technological innovations that has allowed many companies to very regularly test the restorability of their backups. And that is the key to being confident and at ease in one's recovery capabilities. This technological innovation is SureBackup. Let's go. So, to illustrate and understand the concept, principle, and operation of SureBackup, we will start with a bit of whiteboard work and then move on to a small demonstration to see concretely how a short backup is configured and what the prerequisites are for everything to work optimally. So here, the starting point is obviously backups. So what do we have in this environment? We have a 3.3 application represented here. This is an application with 3 VMs, 3 servers that are utilized to provide the application service of this application 3 to 3. So it is a very simple web application, which we will see shortly in the demo. It is an application that consists of a web server, a database, and a presentation server to allow this application to function. This application is backed up here in a Veeam repository. So very classic and very simple things. The objective here for the example is to allow this company to test the restorability of this application, of the entire application, ensuring that this application is restorable and that the backups are usable and optimally restorable. The trick, or in any case, the value proposition of Veeam technologies, is that they will allow for restoration testing by removing all the constraints that are generally mentioned, which we saw earlier in the introduction, namely the lack of available storage space, the need to interrupt production, the applications, the restoration time, and especially the fact that these operations are manual. Therefore, all of these constraints will be lifted by. Indeed, the mechanisms proposed by Veeam will be enhanced by this feature, this SureBackup technology. So the principle is that when we trigger this restoration test, what will happen? First, initially, we will have, here I will represent this. We will have the creation of an isolated environment. An isolated environment, which we will detail later, will show how this isolation is created. But we immediately have an isolated environment that we will call the Datalab. And in this very specific isolated environment, I will indeed note it. Exactly here, like this. In this Datalab, what we will have is 3 virtual machines that will be started inside this Datalab. The 3 VMs will be started inside this Datalab. Therefore, we find our application. I will here indicate app 3 to 3 to clearly show that it is the same application that is being started, which is being started inside the Datalab. At that moment, we have 2 applications that have started, one in production and another that has started within the Datalab, which is running in a completely sealed and isolated environment from a network perspective. The 3 machines are not restored. There is no restoration at that moment. That is why it is not necessary to have available production storage with SureBackup, because there is no restoration. And for that, we use a technology, one of Veeam's key innovations, the ability to start VMs directly from the backup. So, this technology was called vPower, and it is the technology used for recovery time that allows for starting VMs and applications very quickly. So here, in the first step, we will initially have here the first step, which is a commence from backup. So we will have it this way. Commence from backup. I will also represent here, in between these two environments. There is no IP conflict. This is what allows 2009 to operate without impacting production. This will enable the activity to continue without interrupting the application in order to ensure this restoration test. Next, what will happen? When we initiate the restoration test operation, I will represent the second step here. The second step involves performing tests of restorability. So we are going to note the RECO test. So what do we have? We are going to have some check the startup of VMware tools, which will give us or confirm the startup of the virtual machine. We will have ping tests to ensure that the network layers are started on the virtual machine. And finally, application tests, applications that will be carried out. So there are integrated pre-configured tests that will allow you to verify the startup of certain applications, the traditional and fairly standard Microsoft applications, but you can perfectly integrate and import custom scripts to perform customized tests on business applications, or go much further than what is offered by default if you have somewhat specific applications. The third step, after these automated tests are completed, is an important notification sending step. So the idea is that at the end of the tests, Veeam will send notifications and will send a report directly to the email inbox, for example, of the administrator in charge of these tests and verifications. Send report, okay. So in the process and the workflow, these are the three steps for direct startup from the backup. Then Veeam will automatically perform a number of tests on the virtual machine, network, operating system, and applications. And at the end of all this, send a report with the list of what started, what worked, what did not work, and any steps that were problematic or blocking in the restoration process. So what we can see is that what we can say, there is another way to use this technology. What we illustrated is the SureBackup, which involves automatic recoverability tests. So it is a process that will automatically perform the tests and verifications. There are other use cases, other ways to use this technology. For example, when the virtual machines are started in the Datalab, here, you have the perfect opportunity to perform manual tests. Either you delegate the test to Veeam using the verification mechanisms. Once it has started, you can connect. We will represent it like this. As an administrator here, you can log in and enter the bubble. So not quite in the bubble, but you connect to the virtual machines from the VMware consoles. For example, you launch the vCenter, go to the virtual machines and open the VMware consoles directly to access these virtual machines and to perform tests and manual verifications, or to test a number of things in this isolated environment that you can use as a sort of sandbox, a testing environment to be able to test and validate a number of things. So on the Veeam side, the backup server means that if you want to perform SureBackup and automate the verification and allow Veeam to automatically test the restorability of these backups, you will need to configure a number of things at the network level. This is what we will look at in a bit more detail now in this second part. But before that, I will represent it here. We will assume that Veeam, the backup server, is located here. So we will place it somewhere. Here, we have our backup server. The Veeam administrator is here. And To enable this administrator in any case, this Veeam backup server, I will represent it here. The Veeam backup server must implement the functionalities mentioned in point 2 to allow Veeam to perform this verification. The backup server must be able to access the Datalab and the virtual machines inside the Datalab. To achieve this, we will use a component that will act as a gateway, a sort of bridge between the backup server and the Datalab. And this gateway, we will call it, in fact, it is called the Proxy appliance. So we will represent this Proxy appliance here. The Proxy appliance will be positioned here, and it is what enables the backup server to enter the Datalab. So once again, the Proxy appliance is not essential, but if you want to implement these automated testing features provided by Veeam through the backup server, you will absolutely need to go through this network configuration step that will allow the backup server via the Proxy appliance acting as a gateway to enter inside the Datalab. So this is what we are going to see. We will look at how to configure this network part, and we will move on to the second part of the whiteboard to understand a bit about what needs to be configured at the network level to allow access to this Datalab. So what do we have? Here we find the backup server. Here we find the application, our application, 3.3 with a network 104.20.1260.800, the gateway 101, and the IP addresses of each machine, 20, 5, 26, 27. So this is the production. All of this is connected to a virtual switch. The virtual switch is linked to a physical interface, a physical network interface to access the rest of the environment, the rest of the network above. What do we have? The Datalab. The Datalab is connected to a switch, but there is a virtual switch that is not connected to any physical interface. And that is what allows initially to create this isolation. It's an isolated switch or internal V-switch, as we used to say back in the day. And it is the use of this internal switch, which is not connected to any physical interface, that allows for the creation of this isolation and to isolate these machines when they are started directly from the backup. So the machines that are here are exactly the same as those that are started here, except that these ones are started from the backup. This is what we saw earlier in the previous diagram. So we have exactly the same information, the same network, the same gateway, and the same IP addresses. Since these are machines, they are started in the same way as what is started in production. So the goal is to be able to test or implement automatic verification features, automatic tests, and SureBackup. For this, it is essential that the backup server can access the machines that are inside the common Datalab, the backup server that will perform the ping tests and the application tests. And for that, he needs to access it. As it stands, he cannot access it. Something is missing here to make the connection. And the component that will link the production environment and the isolated environment, as we saw earlier, is the Proxy appliance. And we will position it here. We will position it here, 2009. And to this Proxy appliance, we will add a certain number of interfaces. Here we will connect it like this, and there we will connect it like that. Okay, so this proxy appliance, we will note it here to make it clear. Proxy. This proxy appliance has two network interfaces, and we will represent them like this. The first network interface will be placed here. The first network card is connected to the production network. We will assign it an IP address, and we will just take an IP from the production network. So we will, let's say this is fine in production. And let's say that it's arbitrary. We take 4.20.10.9, for example, that's arbitrary. Next, to be a proxy appliance, it must be connected to the Datalab, since its role is precisely to act as a gateway between the production network and the Datalab. So here, I will simply take this and we will position this second interface here, and we will say when each virtual network in isolated environments, and we will give a specific address to this card. This is where one of the key points in configuring a SureBackup is that this interface will be given a specific address. It will be assigned the address of the gateway in the production network. Do you see the gateway here? It's there. We will give it the address of the gateway in the production network. Why, you will see shortly, but we can already talk about it briefly. The machines inside the Datalab do not have a gateway. The gateway is not present. It is here on the production network. We can imagine that it is somewhere here, this gateway 2009, but in the Datalab there is no gateway. So the idea is that all outgoing traffic, all the traffic that needs to leave this Datalab network will be redirected. The gateway, because it is what is indicated in the IP addressing of the machines in the Datalab point 1. So all the machines will redirect IP traffic. The gateway is the proxy appliance that will receive this traffic and then transfer it to the production network. So this interface in the isolated network will always be the IP address of the gateway 101. And we will put it here. IP off gateway in production network. There you go. I hope all of this is clear and readable. Okay, so this is important. I will put it in. It's just that, the gateway is not really important at all. Okay. Now the second tip, the second configuration that needs to be done in the network section, we will see it shortly in the demo. The backup server must be allowed to perform a ping test on these machines. He will test 125, 126, and 127. When we look at the diagram here, there is a problem that will arise. If the backup server wants to test 125, it is this one that will respond. 126 is that one, and 127 is that one. So it is the machines on the same network that will respond, not the one above. Okay? Because there is no direct path possible. We need to find a way, a trick for the backup server to ping 125 without using the address 125. Otherwise, it will be the production network's 125 that responds. And so for that, the trick we are going to use is actually to use network mechanisms. So everything we do at the level of the proxy appliance will use two network mechanisms. The first is what we call IP address masquerading and NAT translation, a source NAT translation from SNAT. We will translate the addresses, modify the IP header to change the IP before sending it to the recipient, before sending it to the destination. So what is going to happen here is that the masquerade configuration will be done at the level of the proxy appliance, and we will have something like this on the proxy appliance. We will write a rule like this: masquerade IP. We will use a subnet that is not in use or a subnet that is available in the environment. Do not use an existing subnet in the production network. So arbitrarily, I chose the subnet 200. So let's say that the IP masquerade is everything that is 104.20.1268. 200x, and let's say we will create a mapping table, a sort of mapping, where IP equals production IP, and the associated production IP is a 104.20.1260.800x. So what will happen from there is another configuration that needs to be done, or rather, that will be done automatically. It is that from the moment the SureBackup is configured at the backup server level, Veeam will automatically update the routing table of the backup server. We will see it shortly in the demo. We will take a look at the routing table. you will see that there are changes that have been made by Veeam, and what will happen, what will be indicated in the routing table is that all the addresses have 200x. So I think you understand that to access 125 from the backup server, you will need to use 225, and therefore everything that is X will be redirected through this interface of the proxy appliance. The 104.20.10.9, therefore, a routing table, a specific routing here that will route everything that is 200 points something V. At the proxy appliance level, we will read the IP mask information and modify it. So this is NAT, it is address translation. For example, the IP 200.20.5 will become 104.20.126.5, and the packet will be redirected. The virtual machine in 120.5, okay, so translation, address translation, therefore source NAT, IP masquerade, and Vim, which will modify the routing table at the backup server to redirect all masquerade addresses. The interface of the proxy appliance connects to the interface in the production network of the proxy appliance so that there is address translation to access the equivalent machines inside the Datalab. Well, I hope all of this is clear and that I have been clear enough in my explanations. Once again, I will mention it here again, but the use of the proxy appliance is not essential. If you want to perform your checks manually, you can configure a SureBackup job without a proxy appliance, in which case you will simply need to connect to the Datalabs. So I will represent here the administrator who bypasses and does not use, who wants to perform tests manually and does not wish to use Veeam mechanisms for automatic verification. Once the Datalab is deployed, it simply needs to connect internally and use the VMware console. So it will connect to its VMware environment. He will connect to the machines and access the consoles to perform tests and verifications. So here. Yes. VMware console, for example. Console. So here I am talking about VMware. It also works under Hyper-V for the additional clarification. Okay, so I suggest we see how all of this is configured in the Veeam backup and application interface. Let's look at it a bit more concretely. We will try to associate the whiteboard with the demo, and I will attempt to detail the different steps so that you can make clear associations and be able to configure this feature and all its mechanisms simply in your infrastructures. So for that, we will come here to this demo environment and we will work with a 3.3 application. So it's a small web application that allows you to make queries in a database. For example, we search on TH, we have a filter, and we perform simple searches at the database level. You can see that currently this application is accessible at 125. So to facilitate understanding, I really use the same IP addresses as on the whiteboard. So this is the presentation web server. It's the front end 125, and here you see I have set it up. So this is web app 125, and there I have the application from the Datalab. Currently there is no Datalab, so you see that access to the application in the Datalab is obviously non-existent because for now there are no machines started. So what we are going to do is go back here to the VMware side. The application is here. You see, these are the 3 virtual machines that are started. They have been backed up. So the idea is to perform restoration tests for this application. We will conduct recoverability tests. So for that, we will go into Veeam and launch the operation on how to configure a SureBackup to perform the restoration and restoration tests of this application. In the first step, we will create an application group. This is the simplest method. We could do without the application group, but I recommend using this method. When you have a reduced number of virtual machines, there is another way to do it with linked jobs. which we will see in the wizard, but I recommend using the application group in small environments where you have a limited number of machines to test at once. So we are going to create a group. We will call it application group 1. No, we will simply call it web app, because it is the group that contains the 3 virtual machines of our application. And we will go get it. We will take this backup that contains the 3 servers. So I will go back a bit to mention a few things. Here you have the option you see for each of the virtual machines to define the types of tests that are performed. You see that there are DNS roles here. So these are infrastructure servers. You have SQL, email, and web server. So these are predefined roles. You just need to check these boxes for Veeam to know exactly what application it needs to test and what application service it needs to verify. Additionally, you can integrate supplementary scripts if you wish to go further in the tests conducted. If you want to do some more customized things, you can import scripts at this step. Here, this is the credential part. So, we will apply, and that will be it for this part, application group. I would like to add a clarification regarding the application group. The idea of application groups can be used in 2 ways. The first way is to use them for the servers that are necessary, which are essential for testing your application. So most of the time, what we include in the application group will be infrastructure servers, such as a domain controller, a DNS, and DHCP, which are essential infrastructure servers for the operation of certain Microsoft applications. For example, if you want to test Exchange, you need a domain controller and an associated DNS. So in the application group, we will position these infrastructure servers and then integrate the applications in a different way, which we will see in the assistant. We will integrate them via the linked job option. But I prefer, once again, the number of machines you have tested is not too important to include all the machines within the application group, both those necessary for the operation of the domain controller and the other servers that run the application. It is much simpler and provides the ability to keep Datalab running beyond the test conducted. So that's done. Next, we are going to create the Datalab. So Datalab or Virtual Lab, you can see that the old name Virtual Lab is still there. That is the original name. It has become Datalab in the more recent versions. So you will see in the Veeam documentation sometimes Datalab and other times Virtual Lab, but it refers to exactly the same thing and the same concepts. So we are going to create this Datalab. The Datalab. We will call it Datalab to be original. Datalab. Next, we will choose the hypervisor that will run the Datalab, because concretely, the Datalab is actually a machine, a small Linux VM, a small NAT router that is automatically deployed by Veeam, and it is a VM that will run on one of the hypervisors in the environment. So we will indicate the hypervisor to use to operate this Datalab, to run this small network that will act as a proxy. So we will put it on this one. Okay, we'll leave everything as it is. By default, we won't change anything. We will move on to the next step. And here we arrive at one of the most important steps. You see that the use of the proxy appliance is optional. If you do not wish to use Veeam's automatic verification mechanisms, but prefer to conduct the tests manually by connecting directly to the VMs once they are started from the backup, you will need to uncheck this box if you want Veeam to handle it. This is the recommended method because the goal is also to automate, reduce manual operations, and ensure that it is not a time-consuming operation or task for the teams. So the best practice is to use the live automatic testing mechanisms, but for that you need to check this box and then obviously configure the proxy appliance. So what do we have? Here we have nothing to change. We will leave it as is. On the other hand, regarding the IP address, either you have a DHCP in your production network, in which case you leave the IP addressing automatic. Since I don't have DHCP, I will set an address, and remember that in the diagram, I will make it reappear. Here, we are in the process of configuring that. It's not good. We are in the process of configuring this in production. So we will set 104, 20, 10, 904, 20, 10, 9. All right, let's go. 104, 20, 12, 60, 804, 20, 10, 9. The mask 2, 5, 5, 2, 5, 5, 2, 5. Default gateway. We don't need DNS for now. We don't need it for what we want to do. And we validate. Okay, then next. We will now configure the upper part of the proxy related to the connection to the isolated network. We will rather I recommend using the manual method to really master the configuration, know exactly what you are doing, and perhaps have a bit more ease in troubleshooting in case you encounter network problems. So we will rather be in this configuration, single host. Therefore, if you have standard virtual switches, if you are in a configuration with distributed vSwitches, you will need to select advanced multi-host manual configuration. I do not have standard virtual switch DVS, so I will position myself in this option of advanced single host manual configuration. This message, you get it from time to time. It's not a big deal. It wasn't able to resolve. We'll do things manually. So here, we are going to do the mapping. The idea here is to map the production network. So we are going to access the production network here versus the VM network. Okay. And here is the isolated network. It is called Datalab VM Networks, and we will leave it as is. The name suits me. It took the name from the Datalab and added VM network. So this is the isolated network. Here we have a mapping between the production network and the isolated network. Why are we doing this mapping? Because it may happen that you have multiple subnets. If you have several subnets in production and want to test applications that are in different subnets, you will need to create different isolated environments. If you have two subnets, two applications in two different subnets, you will need two data labs, two different isolated environments that correspond to these subnets. Therefore, it is important to map them. It is important to indicate clearly, make this correspondence accurately in the configuration. Okay. Then this is the step, one of the most important steps. Here we will configure the entire connectivity part. So connectivity of the proxy appliance. We will select the isolated network. You see, we actually want to connect here. I'm going back to the diagram. Forgive me, I'm coming back here. What we want to do now is configure this. The idea is to specify which isolated network we want to connect this proxy appliance to. In my diagram, there is only one isolated network, but we could have had 1.2, for example, or 1.3. So the idea here is to say that this WNIC wants to connect to this isolated network, okay? So we are going to do it here. I come here, I will select, so virtual entity, I will connect it to this network. This is the isolated network. Not a big deal. He couldn't resolve it, but that's okay. And here we are going to configure that. I'll be back once again. Do you remember that IP address? That corresponds to the gateway, the production environment there. 100 points. So we are going to configure. We will configure this, and I will come back here. So 104, 20, 1260, 801. That is the gateway. If you have any doubts, it's always good to read what is indicated. You see the small texts displayed in the interface. They are very helpful when you are unsure of what you are doing. Take the time to read, and you will see that here the indication is quite clear. The proxy, appliance IP in the letters network is generally the same as the gateway IP address in the corresponding production network. So 250, 5.255.0. 5, 250, 5, 250, 5, 0, there you go. And here is the configuration of the masquerade network. Remember, if I go back again, we said here masquerade, it's 200. I took 200 of randomly, it could be 2002, 202, 30, whatever you want. However, you must ensure that this network the network you select here is a free network that is not in use and is not present in the production environment. So I took the network 104.20.12.60.8.200, and so I come back here, I will put 200. So that means 104.20.12.60.8.225. It will correspond to 104.20.8.25 to be able to access the virtual machine that is in the Datalab. Okay, no need for DHCP. We'll leave it like that. So we're doing pretty well. So XIP Mascara, the VNIC in, the isolated network is 101. So our configuration is complete. We click next. We arrive here at the static mapping section. Oh, I won't do it, but just remember that the static mapping part allows for static use, which is useful when you regularly need to grant access to a particular user to the Datalab. For example, if you have an application manager or a user conducting restore tests who is familiar with the application, allowing them to access the Datalab to test various things, since they cannot go through the backup server, the idea is to set up static routing on a machine in the environment to enable this connection, allowing access for a user, for instance, from the environment in the default configuration. The operation is not necessary because the routing table will be updated dynamically by Veeam directly on the backup server. If you do not want this dynamic management and prefer something static, you will need to check this box, select or reserve an IP address in production. Okay, so we are doing pretty well. We will let all of this apply and allow the proxy appliance and the entire pre-configuration to be created and deployed. So once that is configured, we have the Datalab configured and the application group configured. We are going to create the automation, the automatic tests, and for that, we need to create a job called job on backup. So we will leave the default name and select our Datalab, associating it with our application group web app, where we find our VM. So the job is actually this. We will associate it. We take a Datalab application group, we will put it in the Datalab, and then Veeam will perform the tests and checks. We will tell it to keep the application group running after the job is complete, and we will tell it to keep the VMs running. Once the Veeam checks are completed, we want to keep the VMs running for a few hours or a few minutes to conduct additional tests. So I will check this box because I would like to test and show you a couple of things after. Next, here is the link job step. Do you remember? I was telling you that there was another way to do it. It was to create application groups for infrastructure servers, such as domain controllers, DNS, DHCP, and all the servers that are essential for the functioning of the application, and then for the application itself. Come here by clicking on the job link and retrieve the machines that provide this application service. We are not going to do it since I have chosen to put all the machines of my application in the application group. It was much more straightforward in the past. For a bit more simplicity, when you don't have too many VMs to test simultaneously. In the settings section, there are some interesting things. You see, you can test the malware, scan part, check for the presence of malwares, 2021, and test the integrity of the backup file. And in version 12.1, because we are currently in version 12.0, in 12.1 of Veeam, you have additional options to perform tests with Yara files, to look for traces and indicators of compromise within the backups. We are not going to activate all of this. We are not going to schedule. You see, you have here the scheduling of the job every week, every month, depending on what you want to do. We will definitely validate all of this, and I will execute it right away for our demo. So here it is interesting to see the progress of the checks. You have the information organized by column. So we have our 3 machines for the web application, the heartbeat test, the ping test, the scripts, validation, backup file integrity, and antivirus, with a potential malware scan if you have it enabled. And then in the 12th one, you have an additional column for Yara and detection of compromise indicators and ransomware traces. So here we see that the test and the checks are finished. Heartbeat, ping, everything else was disabled. So Veeam automatically performed its tests and checks. And we are going to take a look at the report. Yeah, that's the simple report. A simple report on the tests and verifications that have been done, if you wish. A brief aside, to have much more advanced reports, to have superior testing capabilities, much more sophisticated, to have much more latitude, to be able to have collaboration features, to enable multiple teams and individuals to collaborate. We have a technological response for that. We have a solution called Veeam Recovery Orchestrator, which is an orchestrator that allows you to orchestrate your restoration tests and recovery tests. So we can use this solution for backup-based recovery, but also for recovery based on VM replication. So Veeam Recovery Orchestrator 4, detailed documentation with much more advanced information on business recovery indicators, RTO values, RPO values, etc. So, once the Datalab is started, the tests have been done, I would just like to quickly show you the VMware side. Here, therefore, on the hypervisor virtual switch. So, here we have the production virtual switch on which the VM network is located. And here you see a virtual switch called Datalab. So this is the isolated virtual switch. So we can see here, we can clearly see the machines, our 3 servers, here, TB and the VM, the proxy appliance that has an interface connected in the Datalab. And we see this same proxy planted right over here. So there is one leg on the production network and another leg inside the Datalab on the network side. If I come, here we will do a ping 104.20.1260.820.5. So this is one of the servers on the production network. It responds, and if we do exactly the same thing here, but to Max Karad's address, we will also get a response. So the server is accessible both in production and in the Datalab. We will see this through the configuration of IP masquerading and the automatic routing table that has been set up locally. So here we do a root print and we will see it here. You see 104.20.1200, 6004.20.1268, 200, 12.168.200.00. It's forwarded. V, the 104.20.10.9 and the 104.20.10.9. Remember, 104.20.10.9. I'm back here on my whiteboard. So I think we have finished this demo. And here, if we connect, you see the 225. We should obviously have access to the application of the Datalab. We have reached the end of all this. It has been a bit long, but it was important to revisit the concepts and detail all the steps so that you have a clear understanding. We started from a starting point and we arrive at the end. I really wanted to show you all the aspects of network configuration, the Veeam part, the VMware part, what happens locally, and then for you to have a clear understanding of the whole thing. The entire value of this innovation, this technology, which is SureBackup. I hope that has been clear for you. It was SureBackup from Veeam. Other videos in the Back to Basics series will be made on different topics, which I will try to explore and revisit regarding the most iconic technological innovations from Veeam. That's it. Thank you.